he says, but you're trying to say, you, Dr. Craig, are trying to say this, that premise 2, the universe began to exist, you're trying to say, too, that the universe began to exist, trying to get that by arguing that everything that begins to exist has a cause. So this is premise 2 of the Kalam. And he says, Dr. Craig, you're trying to prove premise 2 by using premise 1. That's what he says. And he says that a couple of times. In fact, he tries to build an infinite regress out of it. He twice says the only thing that could have begun to exist is the universe, but you're trying to argue the universe began to exist by arguing that anything that begins to exist has a cause. And you know that anything that begins to exist has a cause because the universe had a cause. And we know that the universe began to exist because everything that begins to exist has a cause. And then he's got a little rinse and repeat graphic on there that says, look, you just keep doing this. It's a circle. So, he thinks, and he's committed himself to this, that Dr. Craig is trying to say that the universe began to exist by arguing that everything that begins to exist has a cause. Okay? And then he says this, if the universe is the only thing that began to exist, then Dr. Craig has no footing to assert that everything that begins to exist has a cause. So he says, look, if the universe began to exist, it's the only thing that began to exist. And if that's true, you have no footing to assert that everything that begins to exist has a cause, because there was only ever one thing that began to exist. You're assuming what you're trying to prove, Dr. Craig. That's what DasAmericanAtheist thinks. He thinks that. Right there. That's what he thinks. So, let's look at A, the first thing that he argued. He says, you're trying to say that the universe began to exist by arguing everything that begins to exist has a cause. Really? Because we just looked at Dr. Craig's book, and it doesn't seem like he's trying to say that the universe began to exist by arguing everything that begins to exist has a cause. It seems, according to the book, that he's trying to say that the universe began to exist because actual infinities are not possible. You couldn't form one through addition. The expansion of the universe confirms it, and thermodynamics confirms it. Now, whether all these four little arguments work is not the question. The question is whether or not Dr. William Lane Craig is trying to say that the universe began to exist by arguing that everything that begins to exist has a cause. That's what we want to know. We're trying to find out if that the universe began to exist by arguing that everything that begins to exist has a cause, if that's what Dr. Craig's up to. And look, folks, no, he ain't. He's not up to that at all. He's up to arguing that the universe began to exist from the argument against infinities and the argument from empirical confirmation. This has nothing to do with it. So Craig is not using 2 to prove 1. That's false. DasAmericanAtheist, you get a big F. Wrong. So the second question now is, here's DasAmericanAtheist's second big point. He says, if the universe is the only thing that began to exist, well, I think that's false, but pretend it's true for a moment. Pretend that the universe is the only thing that began to exist. Then Dr. Craig has no footing to assert that everything that begins to exist has a cause. Well, let's look at Dr. Craig's argument. Ask yourself this. How does the universe being the only thing that begins to exist destroy the a priori category of causation? Now, there might be other ways to argue against an a priori category of causation, but you couldn't do it by saying that the universe is the only thing that began to exist. I'll repeat that because it's very important. There might be other ways to argue against the a priori category of causation, but you cannot argue against the a priori category of causation by saying that the universe is the only thing that began to exist. You can't get one from the other. Because the a priori category of causation, that argument, doesn't rely on the universe being caused or universe even beginning to exist. The universe could be a steady state universe that never began to exist, and we could still have the a priori category of causation. Because that category can apply to other things, like gravity or me going like this, that was caused. Even if nothing began to exist, this event was still caused. And that's all a part of the a priori category of causation, which you can't destroy by saying the universe is the only thing that began to exist. So, let's look at this. Let's look at that again. If the universe is the only thing that began to exist, then Dr. Craig has no footing to assert that everything that begins to exist has a cause. So, let's look again. How does the universe being the only thing that began to exist answer the question of why everything doesn't come into being uncaused? The universe could well be the only thing that ever began to exist, and that still doesn't get rid of this, because we can say, look, if the universe is the only thing that began to exist, if it's uncaused, then what you have to believe is that it just popped up for no reason. And if the universe can just pop up for no reason, why not elephants and Cheese Whiz and dirty socks and 18th century proletarians under the heel of capitalism? Why just universes? It's absurd. Once you say that the universe began to exist without a cause, you have to answer the question of why it's the only thing that can do that. Why we don't get, say, miscellaneous blobs of assemblage coming into being, just blobs of matter just popping up. I mean, apparently all this matter just popped up for no reason. Why not other blobs of matter just popping up for no reason? Why don't we have other blobs in this universe just look, a clump of lead. Why not? Or a clump of fundamental particles that have not yet been assembled into atoms through the process of supernova. How does saying the universe is the only thing that began to exist get around the problem of why everything just doesn't come into being uncaused? I don't see that. Because the universe could be the only thing that began to exist, and we'd still have to say it had a cause, because if not, then we're left with, well, why don't other blobs of matter just pop into being uncaused? So that's false. So both of DasAmericanAtheist's arguments fail. The big F. Now, Sisyphus redeemed, in one of his videos called Mereology is a Harsh Mistress, gave a more robust argument, or tried to take the ashes of DasAmericanAtheist's argument and turn them into something good. But sometimes you just can't spin rust into gold. By arguing that Craig is trying to say that the universe began to exist by arguing that everything begins to exist as a cause, he misunderstands the argument. Because Craig is not trying to argue that the universe began to exist by showing that everything begins to exist as a cause. Now, DasAmericanAtheist referred to William Lane Craig as a shit-flinging pseudo-philosopher. He did that in the video in which he misunderstood the argument. He thought that Craig was trying to show that the universe began to exist by arguing everything has a cause. But clearly Craig wasn't doing that. Which means that DasAmericanAtheist called Craig a shit-flinging pseudo-philosopher while he was misunderstanding Craig's argument. Here's something you don't want to do. Never do this. Never call somebody a shit-flinging pseudo-philosopher while you're busy misunderstanding the argument. It could end up on YouTube, and you wouldn't want that. You don't want to have that happen to you. And you really don't want to do what DasAmericanAtheist did at the end of his video, where after calling Craig a shit-flinging pseudo-philosopher while misunderstanding the argument, DasAmericanAtheist tells Craig that he'll be waiting when Craig's done with the playground insults. So you say Craig has the reasoning skills of a toddler, you call him a shit-flinging pseudo-philosopher, you say, what a waste, and then you say, Craig, stop with the playground insults. Don't call someone a shit-flinging pseudo-philosopher unless you understand the argument and you've read the book.